Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Here's the thing. I'm not LGR, Lazy Game Reviews. I'm not Mr. What's his face, Mr. Who's the Boss, or any of those people. 8-Bit Guy, Techmoan, Technology Connections. That's not me. I don't have an education or a background in engineering or computers at all. But I love computers. Now, I'm more advanced than your average computer user, but I don't keep up with like current trends or, liquid cooling or any of that shit. But I know the language. I can program in BASIC a little bit. I know a little bit of C++, not enough to do shit, but enough to fuck around and tinker. I know how to build a computer from scratch, and it all started in 1996 when I got my first computer in 1996, an Atari 800 XL. And I know what you're thinking. Wait, what? And you're looking at the Wikipedia, and you're looking at the calendars, and you're trying to make sense of it. All right, we were poor. We couldn't afford a desktop computer. We couldn't afford a laptop computer to save our life. Now, I already had an electronic digital word processor, electronic keyboard thingamabob. I think it was Smith Corona, if I'm not mistaken. It could have been Hewlett Packard. Don't quote me on this. It was one or the other. I don't remember which one, but I just knew you stuck a floppy disk in the side of it. You could save your work and take it to school. Anyways. So, Atari, you say. They made computers? As you wrinkle your forehead in confusion? Yeah. Actually, they did. It's a long, convoluted story how they got into computers and how they got out of computers. None of that's important to this, what we'll be talking about. And then you're thinking, Commodore. They made the Commodore 64, right? Well, yeah, but they did other stuff too. Actually, they did stuff before they got into the Commodore 64. They did stuff before they got into home computers in the first place. In fact, they got dragged kicking and screaming into the computer industry when they were dead set against it. And then you got Apple. We know the story of Apple. We don't got to get into that. But Atari, Commodore, Apple were the big three computer makers in the U.S. in the 1980s. From like 1978 till about 1991, these were your big players. Now, IBM got into the scene in 81 with the PC. Dell, Hewlett Packard, HP, Micron, and a handful of competitors would come on the scene shortly after IBM with the clones. And then it got real fucking competitive from like 1985 till about 1995. Real fucking competitive. And then the world changed in 95. Windows 95, DirectX basically took over. And now we live in a world where if you own a computer, it's a Microsoft. It's running Windows. It might not be made by IBM or Microsoft, but it's a PC. It is. Unless you're a weirdo that happens to have a Mac for whatever reason, or you use it at work, which is fine. I'm not going to complain. Or you're one of those uber geeks that has something running on Linux. Or something running Linux, excuse me. Got to be grammatically correct or I'll get corrected in the comments. Not really, nobody watches my videos. I'm not calling you nobody, but statistically speaking. But it's okay if you do like this video. I hope you do. But here's what you need to know. Things didn't get super competitive until the mid-80s. Up to that point, there really wasn't much competition. It was Atari, Commodore, Apple. Everybody else was just sort of figuring things out. Coleco made a half-assed attempt to get into the computer business and fell on their ass. And then overseas, you had MSX and BBC Micro and shit like that. ZX Spectrum. I don't say that word. It's Z. Get it right, Brits. God damn it. Anyways. Alright. And then you had the Sinclair and some other stuff floating around. But the thing is, you had no uniformity at all. There were incompatibilities with everything. If you bought a Commodore computer, let's say you bought a Commodore VIC-20. The Commodore VIC-20 had its own tape drive, and its own hard drive, and its own monitor. If you later upgraded to a Commodore 64, You had to upgrade the tape drive and the hard drive, not necessarily the monitor. Depends on what you wanted to get out of the 64 versus the VIC-20. If you bought an Apple II, it came with the monitor built in. So, the point is, you had the Apple, which was all self-contained. You couldn't do shit with it outside of what it was designed to do. And then you had the Commodore family, which had some compatibility and some incompatibility across the line. No compatibility with Apple, no compatibility with Microsoft, or, specifically, no compatibility with PC. We'll get into that. And then you had Atari doing their own thing. Now, for the most part, you had computers that came in two classes. You had the user class. Most of these were 8-bit computers. The Atari 400, 800, 800XL, 600, 600XL, 1200, 1200XL, etc. Commodore had the PET, the VIC-20, and the 64, and the 128 in their 8-bit line. And then Apple had the 2, 2E, 2GS, and a whole bunch of other acronyms. Or you had user computers. So you had business computers. So you had the user computer, which most of them were, by today's standards, toys. By the standard of the day, still kind of toys compared to the real computers, quote, air quotes. But you could do various different, some productivity software on the various systems, and you had some video games on the various systems. But the thing is, if you bought a hard drive, or a tape drive, or a floppy drive for your Commodore, it would not work with your Apple or your Atari. There was no universal compatibility. If you bought an IBM, or an IBM PC as it was called, or an IBM PC clone, there was absolutely no compatibility with the other three. Now, PC was compatible with IBM manufactured computers running, at the time, IBM PC DOS, which would later be renamed MS-DOS, Microsoft DOS. And then there would be a split, and then Microsoft would go on to keep making DOS and Windows, and IBM would make this product called OS2 that's not important. What is important for the discussion is you have three major players, Atari, Commodore, and Apple. You've got IBM also getting dragged into it, kicking and screaming, because they just want to focus on mainframes because that's where the money's at. And then you got Microsoft selling everybody BASIC. Atari ran Microsoft BASIC. Commodore ran Microsoft BASIC. Apple ran Microsoft BASIC. Everybody was giving Bill Gates money. Everybody. They were either buying BASIC from him or they were buying DOS from him or Windows. Everybody was giving Microsoft their money in the computer business. That's still the case to this day. But that's also not necessarily relevant to this portion of the discussion, but it'll come up. But here's what is important. Let's say you bought an Atari computer. You did so for one of two reasons. Either one, you just wanted to tinker with the computer, play some video games, maybe learn BASIC, have some fun, you were a nerd. Or two, you were a serious business person, whether you were a small business owner, you worked at an office, etc., and you needed a computer that could run some software at home, whether it was compatible with your software at work or not, you didn't care. You got a printer, and you could print out documents and take them to work. But again, you had to buy the specific printer designed for your system. Now, there was a little bit, in regards to monitors, more compatibility, but there were also other compatibility issues because some computers were using just basically digital signal out that you had to plug into a converter box to hook up to your TV. Commodore and Atari both supported this. Or you could get RGB or SCART if you were in one of those regions, or you could get CGA, which was not none of these were universal at the time. You either had to have a dedicated video card compatible with your platform of choice and a compatible monitor, or you had to get some kind of converter box to make it work with your equipment, or you had to do a whole hell of a lot of tinkering. Those were your options. Now, if you bought a Commodore 64 and you had a floppy disk with Miss Pac-Man on it, written in BASIC, and you went over to your friend's house and they had an Apple II with a floppy disk drive running BASIC, you could not stick that floppy disk into your friend's computer and it would work. The Apple II would say, "What the fuck is this? Get it out of me. I don't like this. I don't know this." So, why were there so many incompatibilities? Well, for starters, it was a brand new industry. There was no standards yet because nobody won yet. Everybody was trying to be the standard. Either Apple, Commodore, or Atari. Now you got to remember, at this time, Atari was a big player in computers. They weren't an afterthought. They weren't, the little company that could. No, they were a legit contender for computers. Because, like I said, everybody had their entry-level computers, their 8-bit systems. The Commodore 64, the Atari 800, the Apple II. But everybody also had their productivity line, their advanced systems. IBM kept increasing the specs on the PC. Atari introduced the ST line, which stands for 1632-bit because they were running 16 and 32-bit processors. Apple introduced the Macintosh line, which was their 32-bit or 16 and 32-bit computers. And Commodore introduced the Amiga. And I say introduced because they really bought Amiga and then took it over. Kind of. It gets messy because you have people leaving one company to go take over another company and this and that and everything else. It gets messy. We don't have to get into it. You just got to know, the names you got to know are Jack Tramiel, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, Bill Gates. Those are the four guys making all the decisions. Now, Nolan Bushnell was out there for a few minutes and then he just sort of walked away from it. But those are the guys making all the decisions that were affecting everybody, more or less. Not only was there no standard in regards to hardware, keyboard incompatibilities, tape drives, floppy disks, hard drives if they did exist for your system, most of them didn't, graphics cards, RAM upgrades, everything else. There were hardware and software incompatibilities with floppy disks. Most of them came in the standard 5 and a half inch floppy, flimsy floppy, but they weren't all the same. Some of them were double density, some of them were high density, some of them were single density, some of them came in different file systems and file formats, and some of them came with different, like some of them were reversible, some of them weren't. I mean, it was a mess. It was a fucking mess. So what happened? Well, let's talk a little bit about the different systems, right? I would classify them as such, going from low tier, entry level, mid tier to high tier. You've got Atari at the bottom with their 8-bit line, 400, 800, etc. And then their ST line. That's the low tier. The entry level, poor people can get in and pretend they have a computer. In the mid-tier, you've got Commodore. They've got the 64, they've got the 128, they've got the VIC-20 still limping along, and then they've got the Amiga, 500, 1000, 1500. And then at the top tier, you've got Apple, with the 2GS, the 2E, the Apple III, which was a mistake, the Lisa, another mistake, and the Macintosh. And then separate in a whole nother world you had IBM and Microsoft doing their thing. So you really had 4 platforms: Atari, Commodore, Apple, and then PC. Now here's what happened. It gets messy. We're not going to get into the politics or the history of the businesses, but there was a home video game crash in 1983 that affected the North American home console market. Arcade manufacturers were largely unaffected because most of them were in Japan, and the rest of them were importing games from Japan, or they were subsidiaries of Williams, Midway, Bailey, the big dogs. Where you had Sega, they were a big contender, and then you had Konami and Namco and Capcom and Taito and a few others. Like I said, most of them coming out of Japan. Oh, also Sega. The home computer market was not affected by the video game crash at all, but they were there were ripple effects because Time Warner at the time had owned Atari. So Time Warner dumped Atari. Now, I'm going to skim over some of this, but long story short, the then head, I don't know if he was president or CEO, but the head of Commodore left, that's Jack Tramiel, and he bought half of Atari's assets. The other half, they sort of floated around in the ether, because at one point Williams owned them, at one point Hasbro owned them, Infogrames owned them. They were just sort of kicking around, but you had Atari Games and you had Atari Corporation, and I'm not going to sort out which is which. One of them was making computers, the other one was making video games. That's the distinction. The company that was making video games was doing successful with their arcades because they were part of a bigger company that had assets that were, wealthy. But they were getting booted around they were just getting passed around like a bong at a college frat party. The one that owned the computers, however, this was Jack Tramiel, he left Commodore to pick up the pieces of Atari, and he limped along for a few years making computers and home consoles. They had the ST line and the Falcon line, which isn't that important, but we'll talk a little bit about them. And then they had their home consoles. They had the ill-fated and very hastily launched Atari 7800, which could not compete with the Master System or the insanely popular NES by Nintendo. And then they sort of threw the Jaguar. They just wadded up a wad of Jaguar, spit, threw it at the wall, watched it land on the floor, and walked away from it. They sold 400,000 Jaguars. That is beyond a colossal failure. That is so insignificant that it doesn't even deserve to be talked about. The Nintendo Wii U sold 13 million units, and that's considered a colossal failure. So if you can't even sell 500,000 units, you're really not worth my time. But I have to talk about you because you're Atari. It sucks. Because it really had literally zero impact on the gaming community. Or the gaming industry. Or gamers as a whole. Because the 12 people that bought one probably regretted it 5 minutes after they powered it on. But the software company that was making Atari games, arcade machines, they were sort of limping along, keeping some of their franchises alive and introducing new franchises. Primal Rage in the 90s, Arch Rivals at one point, Pit Fighter and a couple other games. Hard Driving is another one. But they weren't doing so hot either. Now let's talk briefly about the Falcon. This is a non-linear story because we're going to bounce back and forth. The Falcon was their 64-bit next generation 3D graphics machines that came out in the 90s that were supposed to compete with the more advanced Amiga, replace the ST, and be competitive against the Macintosh and the impending Windows. Windows existed, but it wasn't the force we think of today. DOS is what ran IBM's at the time. It gets complicated because Windows was not an operating system at the time. It was basically a skin for DOS. It was a graphical user interface on top of DOS, not a proper OS. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Atari finally ran out of money in 1995 and threw in the towel. They sold off what was left of their assets and walked away. The remaining shareholders washed their hands of Atari, and for all intents and purposes, Atari, as we knew it, ceased to exist. The IP continued to bounce around from, one firm of IP holders to another, basically various investors and things like that. But the company was shut down. Their factories were shut down. Their offices were shut down. There's no such thing as Atari today. The company running out of France that uses the Atari name is not the same Atari that was making the 2600 or the, Missile Command arcade machines back in the 80s. It's a different company that owns the IP. Commodore, unfortunately, for various reasons, had a very similar fate. And we're going to get into it. And they had a very similar timeline as well, because they both came on the scene around the same time. Commodore made their first home computer in 77. Atari made their first home computer, or maybe it was 76 or 77, and Atari's was a year later. But they all came on the scene at the same time, and they all left the scene at the same time. There's a reason for that. We'll get into it. So, Commodore took a different approach. Now, here's the funny thing that you didn't know. While there were a lot of incompatibilities with hardware and software and peripherals, all three, the Atari family of 8-bit computers, the Commodore family of 8-bit computers, and the Commodore family of 8-bit computers were running the same processor. The exact same CPU. Now, some of them would make tweaks to the cache, or they would modify the where the transistors were, or the different registers, but they were all coming from the same manufacturer. It was the same CPU running all three systems. It's the same CPU running the Atari VCS, and it's the same CPU that ran the Nintendo Entertainment System. Well, like I said, variations of the same CPU. Kind of like the difference between a Celeron and a Celeron D, but not important. Or an i3 and an i7. It's the same processor with different tweaks. Anyways, but then when they got into the 16-bit era, they all went with different processors. Atari went with one, Commodore went with another one, and Apple went with their own. They actually started making their own processors, sort of. They were contracting a firm to make processors for them. But that's not... And that was only for a brief period of time, and then things got messy, but we'll get back to that in a minute. But the point is, it was theoretically possible to write software that was compatible with all three systems with very little tweaks, because they were all three running the same CPU, more or less the same RAM configurations, and I say more or less because it depended on which model you bought and which upgrades you had. And they were all running the exact same version of BASIC. The exact same version of BASIC on all three systems. Microsoft sold it to everybody. Now, again, Apple made tweaks to the BIOS, and their version of BASIC was modified to do to the functions of their hardware. Same with Commodore, same with Atari. But it was You could write a program, a video game or whatever, for one, and then just convert it to the others relatively easy. I say relatively easy because you'd still have to find a way to get it from one incompatible floppy disk to another to finish writing the code or rewrite it line by line, however you had to do it. But there were workarounds for that too, because there were some third-party peripherals that would allow you to make a floppy disk that was made for one system at least readable on another. Not fully, but if you knew what you were doing, there were workarounds. And again, you had the PC off in the, at this point, off in the ether, doing its own thing. It was successful right away, but it was successful with business people, not the home user, not the gamer. This is important. Because who's using computers? Well, what we think of today as a PC today is a home computer, right? Personal computer. It's used for home productivity, email, web browsing, video production, sometimes, not much. People use it for YouTube, or they use it for playing video games, or working on documents in Office, or OpenOffice, or Word, or whatever. But this wasn't the case in the early 80s. If you bought a PC, you just knew it was for the Microsoft products and nothing else. You were using it for business purposes, home office purposes. Maybe you were a lawyer and you needed to bring your work home, or you were a small business owner and you needed to be able to, work at home, whatever. If you were into playing video games, you either bought an Atari, a Commodore, or an Apple. Now, Apple had some business productivity, more so than Atari and Commodore. Commodore made efforts. Atari didn't even try. Atari didn't make any attempt to get into the business space whatsoever. Commodore tried because they were known as Commodore business machines and they started out as a calculator company. So they had a vested interest in business, but they were going cheap on the home computer route because, like I said, they didn't really want to make home computers at the start. So they didn't make a big effort at the beginning. They would make more of an effort in the late 80s, especially with the C64 and the Amiga line. But that was short-lived, and there's complicated reasons for why that was short-lived, but we have to talk about Commodore now. Commodore's big platforms, and they had other computers, but their main ones were the PET, the VIC-20, the 64, the 128, and then the Amiga line. 500, 1000, 1500, 1200, etc. That was pretty much it. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the 1200 or the 1300 was their last system. And then they folded. And I mean folded as a company. Like they just ceased operations entirely. Somebody out there still owns the trademark and some of the IP and the copyrights to the operating system, the Amiga operating system, which is literally called the Amiga operating system, Amiga OS. But they're not doing anything meaningful with it. Now, Commodore kind of split into two companies at some point, not important, but their two companies were basically the North American company that ceased to exist and the European company, which limped on for a little bit longer. But there were a lot of incompatibilities between the various Commodores. Most of the hardware was compatible between immediate family successors like VIC-20 and Commodore 64, 128, but not fully compatible. Like stuff for the PET, I'm pretty sure wasn't compatible with anything that came later because it was its own thing. It was their first attempt. And there were some one-offs that are not really worth talking about. But Commodore didn't make a serious attempt to get into Office They were focused on home use, which is video games and some office software, but not high-end productivity stuff. Because again, they were trying to keep the cost down on the machines. They had some success, a lot of success, I should say, in the video game space. Because the Commodore 64 in particular was one of the best-selling gaming computers of all time. It gets fuzzy on how you define a computer, but if you're talking about hardware manufactured by one company running the same operating system, it is. But if you're talking about compatible platforms, every version of Windows from 95 on has it beat, but we're not going to mix semantics here. We're just going to leave it at that. Best-selling video or gaming computer of all time. We'll leave it there. Because it is essentially a home console with some computer components plugged into it. Same as the Atari 8-bit. They were basically an Atari 2600 repackaged that you could plug some peripherals into and turn it or use it as a computer. But internally, that's essentially what the Commodore 64 was. It was a home console. It was an NES with a few more accessories. That's basically what it was. More or less. And I'm skimming over a lot of the technical bits because it's not that important. And I don't know all of the technical bits. I know some of them because I had a Commodore 64 at one point and a Commodore 128 at one point. So I know enough that if you sat me down at a functioning Commodore 64, I could make my way around. I could even run the GEOS operating system, which was not a Commodore product, but it ran on Commodore. There were versions of GEOS for other systems, but again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. What is GEOS? Well, it's basically Windows for everybody that doesn't make IBM PCs, more or less. It was the competition to Windows that wasn't the Macintosh. Remember, Macintosh wasn't a standard yet. Macintosh was initially it was sort of a failure. And then it sort of rebranded and got basically redesigned from the ground up in the 90s. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But Commodore didn't have success outside of gaming. Hardly anybody... There were businesses that used it, don't get me wrong, but hardly anybody in the serious business space used Commodore computers. You know, Wall Street, banks, tech firms, they were not using Commodore computers. Hollywood, they might have been using Amigas. They were not using Commodore 64s. But Amiga was designed for that space, and it had some success in Hollywood and television. Television stations used certain Amiga computers because it had good graphical capabilities. But they also used the Atari ST, and they also used the Macintosh. Because eventually, as we'll get to, Macintosh basically became more or less the standard in that space, but not entirely. I worked in the television business, and I can tell you more TV stations use Windows than Mac, but every TV station I worked at had a Mac for specific uses. Newspapers is a whole other thing, but we're not talking about that because that's not important. But let's go back to Apple. Oh wait, let's finish Atari. Or excuse me, Commodore. Well, like I said, they basically, more or less, also ceased to exist in 1995. And I say more or less. I know if you get into the semantics, who owns the IP and the European division, etc., but for practical reality purposes, they stopped mattering in 1995. They had no new products after 95, no new software. Their operations were shut down. Their factories were shut down. Their headquarters were shut down. They essentially ceased to exist. They were no more. Kaput, gone, done. Okay? Then we have Atari. God damn it, Apple. Their names are too similar. Ugh. Apple took a different approach. They also had some success in the gaming space, but they were not that successful getting into the business space. Little bit more so than the other guys, but not competitive with IBM. IBM was the de facto for business. Mainframes, if you were into high tech, like if you were a hospital or a research facility or a university, and if you were in a low tech space, like, an office or, a bank or Wall Street, you went with the PC, the IBM PC. You weren't wasting your time with Apple or Commodore or Atari because you knew it was not beneficial. Because everybody else was using DOS, you needed to be using DOS as well. This is just the case. BASIC wasn't going to cut it. Now, there was a version of BASIC available for some PCs, and there was a version of DOS available for some of the non-PCs, and that's where things get messy. But again, we're gonna sweep that under the rug and move on. But if you were in the home space, you probably weren't interested in an IBM PC because they were too goddamn expensive. And while they could theoretically play video games, they had the components within them to make compelling video game software. They had decent specs compared to their competitors, but not for the price. They were hella expensive for the price. For the specs, I mean. But people weren't really writing video game software for IBM. Now, there were some companies like Sierra Online and the Learning Company that were putting out software on everybody. And that included IBM PC. But your big gamers, players in the gaming space, Sega, Konami, Atari, Namco, and everybody else, they weren't interested in PC. The Japanese companies focused mostly on MSX in Japan, and then, a Commodore in the US. Or Atari. Commodore or Atari in the US. Or they tried to get in their own foot in the door, which most of them failed. I mean, all of them failed, I should say. None of them were successful. Now, there were other companies manufacturing computers at this time. A lot of them. But those companies were manufacturing clones of one of these other companies. Be it a Commodore clone, an Apple clone, or an IBM PC clone. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think there were any Atari clones, but I'm not saying there weren't. I'd love to find out if there was, but basically, there were a lot of companies making hardware and software compatible for the other players. They weren't making their own software or operating systems. Dell, Hewlett-Packard, Packard-Bell, those were the big ones. I guess Micron was floating around out there. Tandy, those were Radio Shack. Those computers were just Tandys were just PCs. They were PCs under a different company. They were made by a different company, but they were compatible with the PC. That's basically all they were. I know there was the TRS-80 that predates the Tandy line, but that is so far in the past that it has no relevance on anything that we're talking about. Because that was a one-off that they did for a little bit and then decided that PC was the way to go. Also, by the way, Radio Shack, another company that doesn't exist anymore. You're noticing a trend, aren't you? Yeah. Aside from Apple, not a single company that was making computers in the 70s or early 80s is still making computers today. Apple's the only one. Everybody else got out of it. IBM got out of it. Dell came on later, so we're not talking about them, but we're talking about like 81 to about 76. Every company that made computers from 76 to 81, they're not making computers anymore, if they even still exist. Most of them don't. IBM and Apple still exist, but again, they're the only ones. What happened? Apple had a big part in it. A bigger part than you realize. Because Apple took a different strategy. They took a backdoor to get into people's homes. What they did was they sold their computers very successfully to schools. And schools were eating them up. And so if you were sitting in typing class in junior or senior high in 1984 and you were typing on an Apple IIe or 2GS or whatever, and you needed to take your homework home with you to work, to come back the next day to finish your project, you basically had to twist your parents' arm to get an Apple-compatible computer so that you could stick that floppy disk in the drive and your machine would read it and you would have the same software and you could work at home. And this was how Apple backdoored their way into people's homes. They got some games, but their computers weren't really designed for games either. And they weren't designed for productivity. What were Apple computers designed for? Well, they were designed for hobbyists, but they just exploded in popularity overnight. And so they had to scramble to find a market because there aren't as many hobbyists as you want there to be. But there were a lot of business users that found out, hey, if my kid's school is using an Apple, I might as well use one too. And so Apple, like I said, backdoored their way into success. They didn't design the Apple II to be a home computer. They designed it basically to be a mass market kit computer for hobbyists. They just lucked out. I don't know how. Everybody's done documentaries on how. Nobody can figure it out because they shouldn't. If you look at what they were selling, they should not have been successful. But they were. That's not important. But they lost their way in the late 80s. Going into the 90s, they were rebranding Macintosh into Mac OS, and they were selling their computers as Macs. They discontinued the Apple line entirely. Everything under the Apple line. Just no more. And they sort of went a different direction as everybody else. They made their graphical product the standard because they were finding success in the home video or the video production industry. And they were, once Commodore with their Amiga and Atari with their ST out of the way, they had that market all to themselves because IBM wasn't interested in that market, neither was Microsoft. At the time, if you wanted Photoshop or you wanted After Effects or I can't remember what's the video software that they... Anyways, Adobe... If you wanted Adobe's products, you had to have a Mac because they did not have Windows versions at the time. Because there was no standard well, there was no Windows yet. Windows wasn't an operating system yet. Mac was. But there was no standard yet. But we were getting there. When did we get there? 1995, Windows 95, DirectX. Why did everything change in 95? Because we finally had a near universal compatible standard platform. Every computer manufactured from 1995 until today has USB ports on it, short for Universal Serial Bus. Every computer from 1995 till today is more or less compatible with Windows software or some version of Windows. And any software made for Windows 95 on can very easily be made compatible with any other version of Windows because they have compatibility built in. This was not the case if you went from Commodore 64 to an Amiga. There was no compatibility between Commodore and Amiga, even though they were the same fucking company. No compatibility between an Apple II and a Macintosh, even though they were the same fucking company. But if you bought a computer in 95 that was running Windows that had DirectX on it, that video game or that software can still run today on any PC-compatible computer. Now, you can say the same thing with PC software going all the way back to DOS, and I'm saying PC as in IBM PC software, because DOS has, or remnants of DOS have remained a part of Windows from the beginning, even till today. You still have the kernel, you still have the command prompt, and you still have the terminal. Those things are all a part of DOS, still a part of Windows. So if you learned DOS as a kid, you could still use your Windows 11 computer as a DOS machine, and the computer doesn't know the fucking difference. And this is why everybody else went out of business. Because if you want to make a video game from 1995 to today, you're making it for Windows. Period. End of story. And then you're porting it to PlayStation, maybe Xbox, maybe Nintendo, but you're making it for Windows. Now, today, if you're making it for Windows, you're most likely selling it through Steam or GOG, but you're still making it for Windows. IBM left the PC market in the mid-90s, never went back. They sold off their entire PC division to Lenovo, and I don't even know if Lenovo still exists. Mm-hmm. But the reason why Windows became the standard isn't just because it was on everything, because it was on everything before, or DOS was. It became the standard because of DirectX. Because if you wanted to make a video game that ran on a Hewlett-Packard computer running an Intel CPU in 1985, you had to write that computer for different levels of hardware. You had to write different code for different graphics cards, different sound cards, different CPUs, different RAM configurations. Literally, you had to make different versions of that game for every conceivable configuration, which was a fucking nightmare. You didn't have to do that with DirectX. You wrote the code to DirectX, and DirectX told the computer what to do with it. So much easier. Why do you think that it's called the Xbox? Because it was originally called the DirectX box. Because DirectX, which launched in 1995 and came built into Windows 95, is the standard and has been the standard ever since. And will probably be the standard long after we're dead. And that is what happened to the three major companies that are no longer relevant. Apple is found success with their iPhones and their iPads, but as far as like desktops and laptops go, they are irrelevant. Yes, some people still buy them, but businesses aren't using them. Hollywood isn't using them. Newspapers are using them, but newspapers are irrelevant, so who cares? That's the story. Stay cool.